I didn't hear the chainsaw at first. What I did hear was a squirrel shrieking, high-pitched, panicked, like it had just seen the face of God, and when I rushed outside in my robe, my coffee sloshing down my leg, I saw the unthinkable. Karen, my neighbor from across the hedge, was on my lawn holding a gas-powered chainsaw like it was a hairdryer, hacking away at my 15-foot-tall privacy hedges like they were cursed brambles in a Disney movie. My mouth opened, but nothing came out at first. My hedges. My grandfather planted those hedges. They were home to birds, squirrels, a particularly judgmental rabbit, and the only thing keeping Karen from glaring directly into my living room every morning while doing her yoga with the curtains wide open. She was screaming something about her right to sunlight and community aesthetics, as branches flew and chunks of greenery rolled onto her designer heels. And before I could even get my phone out, half of the hedge line was a shredded mess of broken limbs and exposed root. That was the exact moment I decided I wasn't going to get mad, I was going to get building. I demanded she stop. She said, with the audacity of a Bond villain, that she was helping me, because the hedges were blocking the view of the street. Her street. As if she personally owned the asphalt. When I pointed out that the hedges were fully within my property line, she said, "Well, they feel like they're on mine," which I assume is how she also handles parking spaces and other people's time. She gestured toward my driveway, where a rental truck sat idling with the words, "Precision Landscaping and Removal," stenciled on the side. Not even a courtesy knock on my door before she brought in her crew. She had actually spent money to destroy something she didn't own. The sheer Karenosity of it all was too much. I called the police, but they said it was a civil matter, and told me to file a report. By the time I hung up, the landscapers were loading the remains of my hedges into the back of the truck like mafia cleanup guys. Karen waved to me and said, "You're welcome," before strutting back into her over-decorated McMansion, where I imagined her pouring herself a mimosa and congratulating her reflection. I stood there, blinking at the empty space where my hedges used to be, and I could already see directly into her kitchen. Her wallpaper was aggressively floral. I didn't want to know that. I didn't need to know that. When I approached the HOA about it, the president, a tired man named Mr. Tannen who looked like he regretted every second of his unpaid position, sighed so hard I thought he might deflate. Karen said the hedges were an eyesore, he told me, sliding a copy of the bylaws across the table. Technically, she has a right to request vegetation removal if it interferes with communal sidelines. I flipped to the section in question. It said no such thing. She had lied. Again. And the worst part? The HOA had used petty funds from the communal landscaping budget to reimburse part of her expense. I'd been fined last year for wind chimes. Karen cut down 30 feet of dense, living hedge and got reimbursed. This wasn't just a Karen story. This was war. I spent the next few days cataloging the damage, talking to a city planner, and reviewing property surveys. What I learned was stunning. The hedges were not only within my property line by a full 2 feet, but they were also listed in my original zoning agreement as an approved privacy barrier. Karen had violated multiple ordinances, including destruction of private vegetation and unlicensed landscaping work. But I knew that dragging this through legal channels alone wouldn't satisfy the fury simmering beneath my skin. She hadn't just chopped down plants, she had violated a boundary. A literal, physical, personal boundary. She had stepped onto my lawn with the power of machinery and the confidence of someone who had never once faced consequences. It was time she did. So I went to work. Not with a chainsaw, but with a sketchpad. I designed a wall. A high wall. A tall, city-legal, fully permitted wall. I visited the zoning office every day, learning about concrete regulations, fence ordinances, setback rules, and even wind resistance standards. I found the perfect combination of height, material, and aesthetic to pass every inspection while being absolutely unbearable for Karen's need for visibility. I even hired a designer to make it look tasteful, elegant, passive-aggressive art. But I didn't start building immediately. No, I let Karen sit in her victory for a while. I smiled at her when I passed her in the cul-de-sac. I waved when she walked her dog on my side of the block, pretending not to see her sneer at the stumps where my hedges once stood. And every time she made some smug comment about her new view, I nodded politely and thought about how that view was about to end forever. On the third week, a cement mixer pulled into my driveway. Karen came trotting out in her athleisure like a hawk spotting prey, phone in hand. "Excuse me, what's this?" she asked, already poised to complain. I said, "Just replacing what was stolen," and handed her a laminated copy of the permit. She scanned it, frowned, and then scanned it again, as if the legal jargon might magically bend to her will. But it didn't. Because this time, every inch of it was bulletproof. Because this time, I wasn't just some guy with hedges. I was a man with a plan and a wall. She said something about calling her cousin at City Hall. I smiled and said I already spoke to him. Turns out he's no longer with the department after a conflict of interest audit last year. Her face twitched. I walked away before she could recover. Behind me, the first panels of rebar were going up. Soon, she wouldn't be able to see the street, or the sidewalk, or the neighborhood at all. And the best part? She wouldn't be able to see me. The next morning, Karen's car alarm went off, not because anyone tried to steal it, but because the vibrations from the concrete mixer backing into my driveway rattled her perfectly aligned lawn gnomes. I watched from my porch, sipping my coffee as the construction crew unloaded rebar, gravel, and bags of cement. The lead contractor, a no-nonsense woman named Veronica, nodded at me and got to work without a word. She was efficient, focused, and immune to Karen's screeching. That alone made her worth every cent. Karen came stomping out in her lemon-colored robe, barking questions at the workers like she owned the land they were standing on. Veronica calmly pointed to the city permits nailed to a temporary signpost on my property. Karen looked like she might explode from the injustice of being ignored. I didn't say a word to her. I let the wall do the talking. Or at least the 15-foot steel-reinforced foundation that would soon support the actual wall. By noon, a trench had been dug and concrete was being poured. Karen stood on her side of the property line, arms folded, face twitching like a game show contestant who just realized they'd bet all their winnings on a trick question. The irony wasn't lost on me. She destroyed my hedges to improve her view, and now she was watching that view slowly disappear under layers of gray permanence. I had done my homework. Every inch of that wall was within the legal boundaries of the HOA code. In fact, I had discovered a little-known clause buried in the community bylaws, Section 14B, Paragraph 6, that stated residents were entitled to privacy structures not exceeding 15 feet in height, provided they do not obstruct community utility access or violate light-sharing easements. My wall didn't touch any easements. I had the property survey to prove it. I even had a letter from the city approving the wall as a replacement privacy structure, due to destruction of natural landscaping. It was Karen's destruction that legally enabled me to build higher than the usual 6-foot fence limit. It was poetic justice, and she knew it. Still, she wasn't one to go down without flailing. That afternoon, she summoned 2 HOA board members to my property. I watched as she theatrically pointed at the construction site, flapped her arms, and showed them photos on her phone, probably from the day she chainsawed the hedges. Mr. Tannen looked at me from across the lawn and gave me a tired, knowing look. The other board member, a young woman named Emily, flipped through the permits and raised her eyebrows. They whispered among themselves, then left without saying a word to me. Karen looked furious. The next day, she tried a different tactic. I caught her standing by the construction zone, snapping photos of the crew and shouting that they were violating community harmony. Veronica calmly walked over, showed her the work schedule, and informed her that any interference would be considered harassment under labor code. Karen sputtered something about calling OSHA. Veronica invited her to do so. I don't know if Karen made the call, but OSHA never showed up. As the wall grew, so did the neighborhood buzz. People began slowing down as they passed my house, watching the progress like it was an art installation. Some nodded approvingly. A few neighbors even came over to ask about the design. I told them the truth. It was the result of destroyed hedges and a refusal to be intimidated. A man named Greg, who lived 3 houses down, confessed that Karen once threatened to report his backyard pond as a mosquito hazard. Another neighbor told me she'd seen Karen yell at a UPS driver for parking in front of her mailbox. Suddenly, I wasn't the guy with the wall. I was the guy who stood up to Karen. Karen, however, wasn't done. That Friday, she marched into the zoning office and demanded an emergency review of my construction permit. The clerk, a balding man named Richard, called me later that day laughing. He said she threw a folder on the counter and shouted, "This man is ruining the entire aesthetic integrity of Elmwood Lane." Richard told her, gently but firmly, that all my paperwork was not only legitimate but double-checked by the head of zoning himself. He even hinted that she might want to review her own property boundaries before making too much noise. That was when things got even more interesting. I decided to take Richard's suggestion seriously. I hired a licensed surveyor to come out and map the exact borders of both properties. The results were fascinating. Karen's custom-built fence, installed last year as part of her garden expansion, was actually 3 feet over the property line. On my land. That meant not only was she encroaching, but she had technically been trespassing every time she pruned her hedges or hosted her monthly wine and cheese gossip sessions out there. Armed with this new information, I didn't confront her directly. Instead, I filed a formal notice of encroachment with the city, attaching the surveyor's map and documentation. It wasn't a lawsuit. Not yet. But it was a clear message. I had every intention of enforcing my boundaries, both vertically and horizontally. When the wall reached its halfway point, about 7 feet high, Karen cracked. I saw her one morning, standing in her upstairs window, trying to measure the remaining distance with a tape measure and binoculars. Later that afternoon, I heard a crash. I went outside to find that she had tried to lean a ladder against the unfinished section of the wall and fallen into her own flower bed. Her dog barked non-stop as she struggled to get up, covered in soil and rage. She locked eyes with me, and for once she didn't say a word. By the end of the week, the foundation was complete. The wall began rising faster, paneled with decorative stone on my side and a smooth concrete finish on hers. I could have left her side plain and ugly, but I decided to keep it simple. Just gray. Emotionless. Impenetrable. It wasn't about being flashy, it was about boundaries. Literal and figurative. On Sunday evening, as the crew packed up their tools and prepped for the final phase, I stood in my yard and looked at the structure taking shape. It was beautiful in its own quiet way. Not because it blocked out Karen, though that was certainly a bonus, but because it represented the one thing I had lacked since she moved in: peace. The next stage would be the top finish, lighting, and a little touch of artistic irony. But that could wait. For now, the rising wall stood as a promise, a barrier not just of concrete and stone, but of resolve. Karen had chainsawed her way into a mistake, and I was building the lesson brick by brick. By the time Monday morning rolled around, Karen was already on the offensive. I was enjoying a quiet breakfast when I noticed a gathering of golf carts and folding chairs assembling near the cul-de-sac. It looked like a retirement community protest, minus the signs. At the center, in a pastel pink power suit, was Karen. Flanked by 2 board members and a small group of residents she'd clearly rallied with tales of exaggerated horror, she strutted toward the sidewalk like she was leading a televised HOA revolution. I didn't have to guess what was coming next. The clipboard tucked under her arm said it all: emergency HOA vote. Karen called an emergency board session, right there in the street. It was theatrics more than anything else. She gave a passionate speech. If you could call a rant with 3 unconstitutional eyesores and a misquote of Robert's Rules of Order a speech, about how my wall was destroying the visual continuity of Elmwood Lane. She waved dramatically toward my house, as if it were a war bunker. She even claimed the construction was making her dog anxious and might affect property values of all decent families on the block. She said the word community 12 times in 5 minutes and cried once, though not very convincingly. I stood on my porch and didn't say a word. I wanted her to dig her own hole, and she was already halfway to China. Mr. Tannen, clearly worn thin by Karen's antics, tried to maintain order but eventually gave in and allowed a vote on whether my wall should be reconsidered under the HOA nuisance clause. The clause was vague, something about structures that substantially interfere with the aesthetic or tranquility of the neighborhood. It had never actually been used before, but Karen was treating it like scripture. The vote passed 4-3. Barely. Karen smirked at me like she'd just won an Oscar, then handed me a formal notice stating that I must cease construction immediately pending further review. I took the notice, nodded politely, and went back inside. What they didn't know, what Karen never even thought to check, was that the HOA had no authority over permanent structures already approved by the city and compliant with zoning laws. The HOA could whine, sure. They could complain. But legally? They couldn't touch my wall. And the best part? I had documented everything. I called my lawyer, Tasha, who was already 10 steps ahead. She'd prepared a dossier with all my permits, zoning code references, survey results, and even email correspondence with the city inspector. The next day, she sent it, along with a polite but firm cease and desist letter addressed to the HOA board. The letter explained, in legal terms, that their vote was unenforceable and any further obstruction would be considered harassment. It was signed, sealed, and carbon copied to the city's legal department and, for good measure, the local news station's community affairs email. Not because I wanted coverage, but because Karen hated coverage that wasn't about her. Karen, of course, didn't take this well. She marched to my property line and shouted that I was a coward hiding behind lawyers. I ignored her. That seemed to make her more furious. The next morning, someone had placed a hand-painted sign on my lawn that read "Wall of Shame." It was in Karen's handwriting. She had even included a drawing of what I assume was supposed to be me, with devil horns and a jackhammer. I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my toast. But things escalated again when I received an anonymous tip, though the sender clearly wasn't very anonymous. The note, written in loopy cursive and smelling of lavender perfume, warned me that Karen had filed a complaint with the City Council's Community Zoning Committee. The goal? To get my permits reviewed and potentially revoked on a technicality. She was pulling strings, or trying to. But what Karen hadn't realized was that her past was about to catch up with her. Remember the survey I had done that revealed her fence encroached 3 feet onto my land? I had included that in my report to the zoning board, along with documentation of her unauthorized landscaping work, misuse of HOA funds, and prior complaints from other neighbors. What started as my wall project had become a spotlight on everything Karen had done wrong for years. A week later, a city inspector visited the neighborhood. Not for my wall, but to inspect Karen's property. I watched from my kitchen window as she tried to charm him with lemonade and small talk. He didn't even take a sip. He took notes. Lots of them. Then he walked down the block, stopping at several homes where residents had quietly submitted complaints over the years but were too intimidated to speak up. Karen had ruled the block with her clipboard and passive-aggressive newsletters for too long. Now the tide was turning. The fallout was swift. Karen received a citation for her fence encroachment and was ordered to move it back within 30 days. She was also fined for unauthorized use of HOA funds and required to submit all future landscaping alterations for prior approval. Her cousin at city zoning? Apparently, he'd been let go after a separate investigation, another piece of karma clicking into place. But Karen still had one card left to play. She filed a small claims lawsuit against me, citing emotional distress, caused by the construction of the wall. She claimed it had ruined her morning rituals, made her feel boxed in, and even interfered with her dog's digestion. I laughed when I read the complaint, but I didn't underestimate it. I knew how people like her operated. Loud, dramatic, and relentless, but not thorough. My countersuit was a simple, razor-sharp response. I submitted all the surveillance footage from the day she destroyed my hedges. Her own voice was on record saying, "What's he gonna do, sue me for leaves?" I had photos, audio, witnesses. I even had a copy of her reimbursement request to the HOA board where she claimed public beautification efforts. The case wasn't just going to be thrown out. It was going to backfire. While waiting for the court date, I put the finishing touches on the wall. The top trim went in, a clean, beveled stone line. Subtle LED lights were embedded across the upper edge, illuminating my side with soft lighting while leaving her side in shadow. I added climbing vines that would eventually bloom into vibrant green curtains of foliage. And as a final nod to poetic justice, I had a stone plaque installed at eye level facing her property. It read, "Good fences make great neighbors." Karen saw it the next morning. She didn't come out yelling. She just stared at it for a long time, her face unreadable. Then she went inside and closed the curtains. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had wanted an open view of the street. Now, she couldn't even see out. The wall had become more than just a structure. It was a monument to patience, planning, and the long game. Karen had thrown tantrums, violated laws, and tried to strong-arm her way through a neighborhood she never respected. And I had met it all, not with fury, but with foundation, permits, and brick. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming peace, one stone at a time. By the time the court date was set, Karen had already transformed her yard into a shrine of passive aggression. On her side of the wall, she had installed an enormous LED screen, which initially displayed bright, flashing text that read, "Prison wall next door." It blinked in red and yellow like a carnival attraction from a dystopian HOA. At night, it cast a hideous glow through her windows and even reflected off passing cars, irritating the neighbors she hadn't yet alienated. One by one, people started to grumble, not because they liked me necessarily, but because Karen's drama was spilling into their homes now. A neighbor named Judith, who once sided with Karen on lawn statute regulations, knocked on my door and apologized for signing the nuisance vote. She called the LED sign an embarrassment to the neighborhood. I told her not to worry. I had no plans to escalate, yet. Karen, of course, took that as a challenge. The next day, the screen changed to a slideshow. It looped exaggerated photos of my wall from unflattering angles, edited to look even taller and more imposing, accompanied by captions like, "Say no to concrete bullies," and "Wall of shame, freedom blocked." I ignored it. But then she upped the ante again. A recording began to play every morning at 7 a.m., a shrill voiceover narrating her ordeal, as if it were a war documentary. It started with fake violin music and lines like, "I once had a view of sunshine and community. Now I live in darkness, thanks to one man's ego." It was so ridiculous that I half suspected she'd hired an actual voice actor. But the final straw for most of the neighborhood came when Karen hosted a wall awareness brunch on a Saturday. She set up tables on the sidewalk, passed out leaflets, and gave out mimosas to anyone willing to hear her rant. It might have earned her a few sympathetic glances, until she pulled out a whiteboard and started drawing diagrams about visual oppression and fence fascism. A kid from down the block filmed the whole thing and posted it online. Within days, the video had over 300,000 views and a flood of comments mocking her performance. The top one read, "Lady, it's a wall, not the Berlin blockade." Meanwhile, I stayed quiet, letting the chaos speak for itself. But in the background, I was preparing something far more impactful than a meme war. I was finalizing a report on HOA misconduct, specifically financial misappropriation tied to Karen's landscaping spree. With the help of my lawyer Tasha and a few quietly supportive neighbors, I gathered invoices, reimbursement forms, meeting transcripts, and statements from past board members. What we found was a pattern. Karen had been using HOA funds to cover personal landscaping, power washing, and even some of her outdoor party rentals, all under vague labels like community beautification. We submitted the full report to the city's neighborhood oversight office, along with a formal ethics complaint. It was only a matter of time now. The inspector who had previously cited Karen for fence encroachment returned, this time with a clipboard and 2 assistants. They walked through the HOA office, inspected its records, and quietly interviewed board members. No one said much, but the silence was telling. Karen saw them from her window and panicked. She rushed outside, demanding to know what was going on. The lead inspector calmly told her to speak with her HOA legal representative. She didn't have one. Karen's focus shifted overnight. The LED sign stopped flashing. The slideshow vanished. The voiceover was gone. Her blinds stayed closed. The woman who had once pranced across the block with a clipboard was now hiding behind curtains, making frantic calls. Word spread that the HOA was under financial audit. Some members resigned. Others distanced themselves from her. One of them, Emily, even emailed me to say she regretted backing Karen's vote against the wall. She'd assumed Karen was just passionate, not manipulative. At this point, the wall was finished. The vines were beginning to grow up the trellis, softening the hard concrete lines with green curls and blossoms. I added a small water feature, a tranquil fountain on my side with smooth stones and gentle trickling sounds. It created a quiet buffer between me and the rest of the street. Peaceful. Exactly what the Hedges had once given me. Except this couldn't be chainsawed down in the name of someone's view. Then came the official notice. The HOA was being fined for misusing community funds and failing to disclose Karen's unauthorized expenditures. Karen herself was named in the report and required to repay a portion of the landscaping reimbursements out of pocket. The board would be temporarily dissolved and restructured under a third-party oversight committee. And while she wasn't removed from her home, Karen was publicly censured by the HOA review panel, which was, in many ways, worse for her. Her reputation, the one she had curated with so much effort and fake charm, was now shattered. Of course, she didn't go quietly. The next time I saw her, she was walking her dog, well, dragging it, really, along the sidewalk, mumbling to herself about unfairness and conspiracy. She stopped at the end of my property, looked up at the plaque I had installed on the wall, and narrowed her eyes. "You think this makes you better than everyone?" she asked, loud enough for the neighbor's porch cam to catch. I didn't answer. I just kept watering the plants climbing up the wall. She stood there for another minute, then turned and walked away, her dog practically sprinting to get out of the awkward silence. A few days later, I received a letter in the mail. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting. It was Karen's. The note was short. It said, "You've ruined everything. I hope you're proud." I didn't respond. There was nothing more to say. I hadn't ruined anything. I'd defended what was mine. I hadn't started the war, but I'd finished it with paperwork, patience, and precision. That week, several neighbors came by with small gifts. One brought a pie. Another dropped off fresh herbs from their garden. A couple thanked me for standing up when no one else had the energy to. One even joked that the wall should be named after me, Noah's Ark of Sanity. I laughed. It wasn't about legacy. It was about quiet. About drawing a line and saying, no more. Karen no longer stood at her window in the mornings. The LED screen stayed blank. The gossip brunches were gone. In place of chaos, there was stillness. My wall had done more than protect my privacy. It had reshaped the entire neighborhood's power dynamic. People saw what could happen when someone calmly, legally, and strategically pushed back. The wall wasn't just high. It was unshakable. And now, so was the message it carried. Boundary respected. Peace restored. Karen silenced not by volume, but by stone. The day of the small claims court hearing was cloudy, the kind of gray sky that felt like a silent warning. I arrived early, dressed in a navy suit and carrying a neatly organized binder containing every piece of evidence I had collected over the past few months. Karen arrived 10 minutes late, storming in with a dramatic flair like she was the star of a courtroom drama. She wore a white blazer, sunglasses indoors, and carried a file that looked suspiciously thin for someone claiming to have suffered emotional distress. She didn't acknowledge me as she passed, but I could feel her stare burning the side of my face as I sat calmly flipping through my notes. The courtroom was small, almost intimate, and the judge didn't look like he had time for nonsense. Karen's opening statement was an absolute performance. She told the judge that my wall had turned her life into a waking nightmare, that it cast shadows over her garden, disrupted her peace, and left her feeling boxed in and psychologically violated. She even teared up at one point, claiming that her dog refused to use the yard anymore because he could feel the hostility in the bricks. I nearly choked trying to keep a straight face. The judge simply nodded and told her to present her evidence. Her evidence consisted of a few grainy photos taken at awkward angles, a therapist's note stating she'd expressed feelings of discomfort due to neighborly conflict, and a printed screenshot of my plaque that read "Good fences make great neighbors," which she described as targeted psychological warfare. The judge raised an eyebrow. Then he turned to me. I didn't need to say much. I let the photos, videos, legal permits, and official reports speak for themselves. I submitted footage of her cutting down the hedges without permission, screenshots of her HOA reimbursement request for unauthorized landscaping, a full property survey showing she had encroached onto my land, and witness statements from multiple neighbors who had dealt with her antics. I also submitted a video of her LED sign flashing insults and blasting recordings at 7 a.m., which prompted the judge to physically flinch. When I finished, the judge sat back, exhaled slowly, and asked Karen if she had anything to rebut the trespassing and vandalism claims. She muttered something about community beautification, and tried to pivot back to her emotional damages. It didn't work. In a calm but firm voice, the judge ruled in my favor. Karen's case was dismissed with prejudice. He also granted my countersuit for the cost of hedge replacement, wall installation delays, and legal fees. It was a substantial amount, enough to sting. Karen stood frozen, staring at the bench like it had betrayed her. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Then, just like that, she turned on her heel and left the courtroom, her heels clicking like nails in a coffin. The news of her courtroom loss spread fast. Not because I bragged, because someone from the neighborhood had apparently shown up in court out of curiosity and posted about it on the community forum. Within hours, the post had replies from neighbors thanking me, others laughing about the LED sign, and even a few confessing that Karen had once tried to dictate what color mulch they could use. By the end of the week, the HOA had officially restructured under city-appointed oversight. Karen was no longer on the board. Her fence had been moved back, her reimbursements were under audit, and her reputation was in freefall. But I wasn't done. I had one final move. The HOA office building had been operating under a lease agreement for years, located on a small plot of land adjacent to the park entrance. Due to the financial penalties and fines levied after the audit, the board had no choice but to terminate their lease and vacate the space. I quietly formed a small investment group with 2 neighbors, created an LLC, and purchased the property at auction. I didn't tell anyone at first. I just posted a sign outside the now-empty office. Coming soon, Neighborhood Peace and Wellness Center, sponsored by Elmwood Neighbors United. Beneath it, in smaller print, were the words, "Respect starts with boundaries." Karen was the first to notice. She showed up the next morning, pacing in front of the sign and taking pictures with her phone. Some said she called the city to complain. Others said she tried to get the new owner's contact info to discuss opportunities. What she didn't know was that she'd be sending those emails straight to me. The Peace and Wellness Center opened quietly a few weeks later. It wasn't anything big, just a modest community space for gardening workshops, meditation classes, and local events. The point wasn't to make a profit. The point was to replace the place where Karen once sat and issued threats with clipboards. Now it was a space for growth, literally and figuratively. We even had a native plant seminar where the speaker referenced hedge preservation. I couldn't help but smile at the full circle moment. Karen didn't attend. She stayed behind her wall, behind her blinds, behind the mess she'd made. The LED sign never lit up again. Her yard, once manicured with military precision, began to show signs of neglect. The gnomes were gone. The flower beds looked tired. I'd hear her occasionally on the phone, still complaining about how she'd been wronged. But she was talking to fewer and fewer people now. And then one afternoon, I saw something that surprised me. Karen, standing on a step stool in her backyard, was painting her side of the wall. Not with graffiti, but with soft blue paint. She wasn't very good at it. She missed spots. She looked frustrated. But she was doing it quietly. No LED messages, no speeches, no brunches. Just paint and silence. Maybe she finally realized the wall wasn't coming down. Or maybe she was trying to make peace in her own way. I didn't care either way. I returned to my garden and trimmed the ivy. The vines were thick now, curling around the stone like nature reclaiming its space. The wall looked beautiful, solid, green, alive. It wasn't a weapon. It was a boundary, a necessary one. And as I watched the sun dip behind the structure that had once sparked a war, I felt something unexpected. Gratitude. Not for the fight, not for the stress, but for the reminder that sometimes the best way to deal with chaos isn't to match its volume, but to outlast it. Brick by brick, quietly, permanently. Karen had destroyed my hedges thinking it would give her more control. But in the end, she gave me something else entirely. Freedom, peace, and one hell of a view.